Ladies and gentlemen, it's with great pleasure I welcome you to the Melbourne City Conference Centre for Cosmic Chemistry. Do science and God mix? My name is Robert Martin and I'm the director of the City Bible Forum, the organisation which is hosting this evening's event. The City Bible Forum is a national organisation which asks the bigger questions with Australia's city workers. And tonight we're asking the big question about a very important issue, the relationship between science and God. And we're extremely privileged to have Professor John Lennox speak to us on this topic. We're very grateful for the Katoomba Christian Convention for inviting Professor Lennox to Australia for the Oxygen Conference. And our thanks also go to our partners, National Science Week and Coorong, in staging these 5 events across the country. And Coorong actually also has a bookstore in the foyer which has books and DVDs by Professor Lennox available for sale. And today there's also a Cosmic Chemistry special answering God's critics, 5 of Professor Lennox's debates and dialogues with some of the world's leading atheists, including Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and the debate he did here in Melbourne with Peter Singer. That's available just for $30 for all 5 dialogues. Normally it would be $100, but it's a special just for Cosmic Chemistry, and it's available after the event. And Professor Lennox will also be available for book signings and so on after the event as well at the conclusion. Now, before I introduce and invite Professor Lennox to speak, I want to draw attention to the outline that you should have received when you arrived on your seat. This contains space for you to write notes from Professor Lennox's address. And the outline also contains a feedback form, and we very much welcome your thoughts, but I'll explain that a bit later this evening. Now, to make it easier to ask questions in a space this big with so many people, and it is a full house here tonight, so congratulations for getting in the first 700 seats. We'd like you to send your questions in via SMS to the number provided, or tweet them to the hashtag CosChem if you're into Twitter. Now, contrary to some expectations tonight, there won't be any singing, miming, or dancing. These are things we're quite happy to miss. Now, if you have no idea what I've just spoken about, then just check out some of the videos on our website and all should be made clear. Tonight at the City Bible Forum, we're serious about engaging the big questions of life intelligently and in a fair-minded way. And to this end, we've invited one of the finest investigative journalists in the country to help us explore and answer this question. Our moderator tonight is Rafael Epstein. Rafael has reported for TV News and Radio Current Affairs in Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, Timor, Indonesia, Europe and the Middle East. He has won 2 Walkley Awards for his investigative reporting at ABC Radio, and after working 3 years at the Age's investigative journalism unit, he returned to the ABC in 2012 to host the Drive program on 774 ABC Melbourne. We're delighted to have such a highly respected and respectable journalist assist us tonight. Please welcome Rafael Epstein. So this evening what's going to happen is Professor Lennox will soon come and he'll speak for around half an hour or so, and then he'll be interviewed by Rafael to explore some of the questions further. And Rafael will also intersperse and utilise in his discussion with John some questions from yourselves. And we'll endeavour to try to get through as many questions as possible, but we regret we may not be able to answer your particular question, but we'll try to get through as many questions as we can. And we should all be done a bit before 9 p.m. as well. I'd like to now introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor John Lennox. John is Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University and is an internationally renowned speaker on the interface of science, philosophy and religion. He regularly teaches at many academic institutions, including the Said Business School, Wycliffe Hall and the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, as well as being a senior fellow with the Trinity Forum. He's written a series of books exploring the relationship between science and Christianity, including God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God?, Gunning for God, Why the New Atheists Are Missing the Target, and 7 Days That Divide the World. He's also debated a number of the world's leading atheists, including Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Peter Singer, and Lawrence Krauss. He speaks Russian, French, German, Spanish, and we hope that you can understand his English tonight. He enjoys amateur astronomy, amateur bird watching and walking. John is married to Sally. They have 3 grown-up children and 5 grandchildren and live near Oxford. So it's with very great pleasure I invite Professor John Lennox to present Cosmic Chemistry, Do Science and God Mix?
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. The last time I was introduced like that, and it was told to an audience that I was interested in amateur bird watching, the first question that came was, what is an amateur bird? So I hope our distinguished interviewer will not be asking me that question afterwards. But it is an honor to be invited to speak in such a forum. And what I want to do is to try and set up some ideas that we can later pursue in depth. The idea that science and God don't mix is widespread. But science and God did mix at the origin of what we call modern science. And that's pretty obvious because when you look at the pioneers of modern science, like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, and so on, every single one of them was a believer in God. To such an extent that historians and philosophers of science generally subscribe to something called Merton's thesis, that intimately involved in the rise of modern science was the presupposition of God. As C.S. Lewis put it, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So I'm not remotely embarrassed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. Now, the important thing to see is that the alleged conflict is not a conflict between science and God. Because you will find, if you go to the level of Nobel Prize winners, last year the Nobel Prize in Physics was won by a Scotsman, to the delight of that nation, Peter Higgs, who predicted the existence of the Higgs boson. He's an atheist. A few years before, the same prize was won by William Phillips of the United States. He's a Christian. Now, clearly, they're not divided by their science. They both won the Nobel Prize. But they are divided by their worldview. One's an atheist, the other is a Christian. And what I want to argue is that the debate should really be about 2 worldviews, atheism and theism, because there are scientists, eminent scientists, on both sides. It's a worldview issue. And so we can rephrase the question. It's what way does science point? Does science point towards atheism, or does it point towards theism, or neither? Now, being a mathematician, I have to be careful with the concept of proof. Proof has 2 meanings in the English language. There's the informal meaning, evidence, proof beyond reasonable doubt, and so on. There is the formal mathematical definition, which is proof is a chain of logical argument based on accepted axioms with accepted rules of logic leading to firm conclusions. You do not find that in any of the natural sciences, and I will not be talking about that kind of proof. I'll be talking about the kind of proof that we experience in everyday life. It's not as rigorously certain as some aspects of mathematical proof, and even that's not certain. But we must not fool ourselves into thinking that we cannot be convinced enough to stake our life on something. For instance, I have been married for 46 years to the same woman. I can't prove mathematically that she loves me, but I'd stake my life on it. Nor could I prove mathematically that the jet that took me from Vancouver to Sydney was going to reach Sydney, but I staked my life on it. So in everyday life, there are many things where we feel the evidence is sufficiently conclusive in order to stake our life on them. So the first point is that the Christian belief in God, far from hindering science, was actually the motor that drove it. And so we have the very odd situation that Newton, who occupied his own chair, of course, at Cambridge originally, now is replaced by Stephen Hawking, who's just not long ago retired from the chair. And Stephen Hawking says you've got to choose between science and God. There is no cosmic chemistry. Science and God do not mix. And so it's an interesting question to ask, what has happened between the time of Isaac Newton and the time of Stephen Hawking? Well, quite a few things have happened that have generated what I call the fog. And fog comes in various sizes and senses, but there's a lot of confusion about certain fundamental ideas, and I want to recite some of them. The first thing to realize, I think, is that statements by scientists aren't always statements of science. So, for example, when Stephen Hawking not long ago in an interview with a British newspaper said, religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark, that isn't a statement of science. It's a statement by a scientist. Incidentally, my reply to it in the same newspaper was, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. You shouldn't laugh, because that proves nothing. Because both of them really are stemming from the Freudian objection. And we've heard a lot of it, because Richard Dawkins' famous book is called The God Delusion. And I was in the Netherlands recently, and two separate people, one a professor of physics, another professor of sociology, accused me of believing in a god like Santa Claus. So I put it to the audience and said to them, ladies and gentlemen, who of you came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult? And there was absolute silence. It is very foolish and naive to put God into the same category as Santa Claus. I know thousands of people who've come to believe in God as adults on the basis of evidence, not to believe in Santa Claus. But of course, this whole idea, it is tangential to science, but it's one of the things that Richard Dawkins likes to do. It's a statement about psychology. Now, he's not a psychologist, nor am I. And when we go outside our fields, which I'm doing tonight, we need to be very careful. We need to consult experts. And the interesting thing is, when you consult the experts on psychology, let's go to the past president of the Royal College of Psychologists and Psychiatrists in Britain. Commenting on the God delusion, he says, you know, the positive beneficial effects of belief in God are the best kept secret of psychiatry. And if the results of massive meta-studies, that is studies of studies, had gone in the opposite direction, and it had been demonstrated that religious belief was harmful, it would have made headlines in every newspaper in the world. But because it's gone in the opposite direction, it appears to have been suppressed. At any rate, Richard Dawkins shows zero evidence of ever having read it. A best-selling psychiatrist in Germany is Manfred Lutz. He's written a book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten. It's not into English yet, a brief history of the great one. And in it he says, if there is no God, then Freud gives you a brilliant argument to demonstrate that religion, belief in God, is a psychological wish fulfillment, a crutch for the weak, and all the rest of it, if there is no God. Of course, if there is a God, the very same argument, he points out, shows you that atheism is a wish fulfillment, a desire never having to meet God, never to have to be accountable for the things we've done wrong. And so he says it's a two-edged sword. But on the substantive question, whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, nor Frankl can help you at all. So that's one of the reasons people making wild assertions about subjects outside their own understanding and assertions that are demonstrably false. The second thing is this. Part of the fog is generated by confusion about the nature of God. The last time I stood in this room, I was debating the editor of Skeptic magazine, Michael Shermer. And I met him not long ago in Oxford at one of our formal debates. And he accused me of atheism, which was an interesting thing to do. He and two others were there, Richard Dawkins, who didn't debate, but he was there, were glaring at me. And Shermer said, you are an atheist. And then he said, with respect to Artemis, Baal, and he went through the whole alphabet nearly until he got to Zeus. And of course, I confess it readily. I am an Azeusist. highly convinced Azucist, Wotanist, Baalist, and so on. And then he said, we just go one God further. And we dismiss the God of the Bible. And I thought that's a very interesting statement because it reveals to me where a major problem lies. And that is there's been a substantive shift in the conceptualization of God on the part of many of my atheist friends and colleagues. They think that I believe in a God who fits into the ancient Near Eastern pantheon, gods of thunder, gods of lightning, gods of sex, and so on, which are essentially what we would now call gods of the gaps. I can't explain lightning, so I postulate a god of lightning. And then I go and study atmospheric physics at Melbourne University, and that god disappears. Now, listen very carefully to this. If you conceive God to be a god of the gaps, then you've got to choose between God and science. Let me repeat that. If you imagine God to be a god of the gaps, that is a placeholder until you've got a scientific explanation, then of course you've got to choose between God and science. But notice why. It's because of the way you define God. Now, of course, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. So when Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, well, I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. No, he wrote the Principia Mathematica, arguably the most famous and brilliant book in the history of science, expressing the explicit hope that it would convince a thinking person to believe in a deity. He didn't believe in a God of the gaps in that sense, and of course it stands to reason. The more you understand of art, the more you can admire the genius of a Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. And the more we understand of the universe, from my perspective, the more we admire the God who did it that way, because the God I believe in is a God of the whole show, the bits we do understand and the bits we don't. And it's the bit we do understand that lead me further and further to the conviction that there is an intelligence behind the universe. So confusion about the nature of God has generated a fog that's producing the disparity to say that science and God don't mix. But then there's confusion about the nature of science. We live in an age where science has been phenomenally successful, especially in its technological spin-offs, and that's wonderful. We all enjoy them. But some people have come to the conclusion, like Stephen Hawking, that, I quote, philosophy is dead. It's now for scientists to bear the torch of the truth into the generations to come. That was a very odd statement because he then proceeds to write a book on philosophy. And in my opinion, proceeds to show that at least for him, philosophy is very dead. But the interesting thing is what he is saying is what we call scientism, that science is the only way to truth. Bertrand Russell once put it like this: what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know. And Bertrand Russell was a brilliant mathematician, philosopher of science, but both of those things left him when he made that statement. Because the statement, what science cannot tell us, mankind cannot know, is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. You cannot know it if it's true, can you? Perhaps it's too late at night for logic like that, but there we are. Secondly, we need to realize that scientific explanation is limited, even on its own terms. When you learned the law of gravitation at school or in physics at university, what do you think it explained? Did you think it told you what gravity was? Because if you do, you're seriously mistaken. Newton realized it didn't tell you what gravity was. Nobody knows what gravity is. The law of gravity is brilliant. It gives us a mathematical equation with 8 symbols in it that enable us to land a person on the moon without even Einstein's correction. But it doesn't tell you what gravity is. And the problem is we take this word explanation and we think that we've unpacked it completely. And if there's a scientific explanation, that's it. It isn't it even within science itself. Nobody knows what energy is, for example. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman. You see, Wittgenstein made the point brilliantly. He said the greatest deception of modernism is that the laws of nature are explanations for the phenomena of nature. They are not. They are descriptions that enable us brilliantly, of course, to make predictions, but they are not explanations in the complete sense. Now, I want to add something to that. Very simple analogy. You all know it. Why is the kettle boiling? Well, because there is heat energy from a Bunsen flame going through the copper at the base of the kettle and agitating the molecules of water. They're going faster and faster and faster, producing steam and so on. That's not why the kettle's boiling. It's boiling because I need a cup of tea. Well, I'm glad you laugh, but the point is very serious. Those two explanations do not conflict. They don't compete. They complement. The one is a scientific explanation. The other is an agent, personal explanation. Now, if we scale that up to the level of the cosmos, asking us to choose between God and science is like asking you to choose between Henry Ford and the law of internal combustion to explain a motor car. It's absurd, and I find school kids can see it. I wonder why some university professors can't. This is a very important thing. Explanation comes at different levels. And peace be to Richard Dawkins, God is not the same kind of explanation as science. He doesn't compete. Just as Henry Ford is not the same kind of explanation as the law of internal combustion. So, we of course come then to the famous thing. I might as well deal with it now because it seems to be the heart of so much argument these days, which amazes me. I used to meet it in Russia frequently, but never in the West until it started to be popularized by Dawkins and some other people. That this notion of explanation, of postulating a God to create the universe, is absurd anyway, because it leads to an infinite regress. Who created God? Who created the creator that created the, and all this kind of thing. But that's not so. You just have to think about it for a moment. Let's abstract it. Who or what created X? Now, philosophers call that a complex question. Not that it's complex, but that it hides assumptions. If I ask who or what created X, I'm assuming X was created, of course. Who created X? I'm assuming X was created. If X is not created, the question doesn't even apply. Do you see that? So, in fact, this much vaunted argument that knocks down God's existence, as in the heart of the God delusion, does no such thing. It only applies to created gods. Let's put it this way. If Richard Dawkins' book had been called The Created Gods Delusion, I don't think anybody would have bought it, because we know they're a delusion. But there's a little sting in the tail, as I put it to him. He believes it's a valid question, which it is, of created gods. So I asked him, you believe the universe created you. So if your question is valid, I can ask it to you. Who created your creator then? I'm still waiting for an answer, and it's taken 8 years now. So the idea of who created the creator is a non-starter, it seems to me. Now, the next fog generator, and it's a very big one, is confusion about the nature of faith. I believe in God. And nowadays, the word faith has been hijacked in Webster's dictionary in the United States. Faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. Now, that is blind faith, of course. The kind of attitude that causes young men to drive planes into tall buildings. And it can be very dangerous. And so we got to face the question. On the one hand, and I speak as a Christian here, other faiths must rightly speak for themselves. And now I'm using faith as a shorthand for a religion. And here's where all the problem comes from. Because faith means 2 or 3 different things. We often use it as shorthand for a religion. I'm of the Christian faith. But faith in the ordinary usage comes from the Latin fides, which simply means trust. So we could talk about faith in the markets, and then everybody understands you. We thought we could trust certain bankers, and then the markets froze because the evidence base was not there to trust them further. And until a confidence base of evidence could be built, the markets couldn't shift. Everybody in the Western world understands what evidence-based faith is. And it's important in a debate like this to realize that when I speak about faith in God, I mean evidence-based faith. I've got reasons for believing in God. And indeed, that's quite clear in the basic documents of Christianity. The fourth gospel, for instance, ends, or almost ends, with the words, Jesus did many other signs, but these ones are written, that is, I've chosen these, in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence upon which faith can be based. You'd be foolish to base your trust without any evidence. That's one side of it. But the even greater danger is this, that if you define faith to be believing without evidence, you'll fail to see that science is faith-based. And that is very dangerous indeed, because it leads to a totally false opposition between science on the one hand and faith on the other. You see, as a scientist, quite apart from God, I have a fundamental credo. You've got to believe that science can be done before you do it. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? And more particularly, in order to do science, you have to believe in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Einstein saw this clearly and said, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith that science could be done, faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. Now, this is where the fun starts, at least from my perspective in the 21st century. Because Darwin saw a difficulty with this. It's called Darwin's doubt. I quote, with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. That doubt persists. Listen to atheist, brilliant Professor John Gray, professor of the history of European thought at London. Modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. Now notice he's pitching Darwinism against science. This has nothing to do with God at all. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. And so we get this extreme reductionist version of things, that everything, every phenomenon can be reduced to physics and chemistry. So ultimately thought is reducible to the firing of synapses. Now, my teacher of quantum physics at Cambridge, John Polkinghorne, points out again and again in his writings that this is nonsense. If it were true, we'd never know it. Because if you reduce thought simply to an epiphenomenon of the firing of synapses, he says this, it destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They're neither right nor wrong, they simply happen. The very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. Quite frankly, that cannot be right. And none of us believes it to be so. Now, that's some years ago. But more recently, serious philosophers have begun to take this up. C.S. Lewis pointed it out in the 1940s, and people didn't really notice it. He said we need to do some thinking about thinking. What about the validity of our thinking? And Alvin Plantinga, one of the world's leading philosophers, he's a Christian, writes this. Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes. Then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. His biology and his belief in naturalism would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Far more interesting than that, because you might accuse him as a Christian of bias, Thomas Nagel, one of the most brilliant philosophers in America today, who is an atheist. He doesn't want there to be a God, and he says so explicitly. He wrote in a book that is startling in its title, Mind and Cosmos, subtitle, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. He's thinking of thinking. If the mental, he writes, is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Let me put that in a very informal, up-to-date way. I talk often to my colleagues at Oxford, and I throw in little questions like that. Tell me, what is the mind? And many of them say it's the brain. That's a very popular view these days. What is the brain? Well, to cut a long story short, the brain is the physico-chemical, electrical end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I say, and you trust it. I said, if you thought that any of the instruments you used in your lab were the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it for a moment. Now, that is, in essence, the argument that is being ramped up today. And basically what it amounts to is this, that atheist reductionist assumptions don't only shoot themselves in the foot, they shoot themselves in the brain, and that is usually fatal. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor. I encourage you, I can see some of your text questions here on the screen, so I encourage you to keep sending them through. I can see the tweets as well, and I'll try to weave as many of them through as I can. Professor, I had actually a whole lot of questions prepared, but two really simple and quite personal questions occurred to me, first of all.
Sure.
I wonder, it might be helpful, and I'm just curious, for you to set out what sort of God do you actually believe in? Have you got a definable way of talking about that?
Oh, I think so. After all, I'm interested in evidence. So what I'm talking about is the God of the Bible. That is the God who is the creator of the universe and the sustainer of the universe. But more than that, a God who is personal. And if it is true what is claimed in the Bible, and I believe it to be true, that human beings are made in his image, we can get a picture of God in the reverse Freudian sense. In other words, God not a projection of our imagination, but we are a projection of God's imagination. We are made in his image. So we are persons. We are capable of a whole lot of things. We are creative. So you can begin to build up a picture in that direction. But there's a lot more to it, because, of course, central to the Christian faith is the claim that God hasn't hidden himself, but has revealed himself, particularly through a whole historical process, but also to the fullest extent in Jesus Christ. And the claim is that he is God become human. So a short, and I don't mean it to be a trite answer to your question, Raphael, would be, the fullest picture I have of God is what I read in the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that revelation of God is, to my mind, completely adequate to have a picture that makes sense both intellectually and, above all, practically, and is livable with. So that's where my sources would be.
Isn't the obvious intellectual conclusion from that, though, if that intellectual framework is coherent, does that not mean that other forms of belief are invalid?
Well, it depends what the other forms of belief
well,
are.
Take your pick. I mean, it could be pantheism, could be Judaism.
Oh, yes,
could
absolutely.
Be
but you see, let me put it this way. What you're doing is asking a crucial question which has to have a pre-answer before you can discuss it.
Okay.
What I mean by that is this. When it comes to talk about other religions, for example, take the three great monotheistic faiths. That'll do us for the moment anyway. Judaism,
we've only got one evening.
Christianity, and Islam. We've only got one. The first thing I will always do before I ever try to answer your question is point out that around the world, in all belief systems or none, you find a very solid common morality. For example, the golden rule is to be found everywhere without exception. Now, from where I sit as a Christian, that makes sense, because we are made in the image of God as moral beings. But the corollary of it is vastly important. When I speak and try to evaluate faiths other than my own, I'm not looking down on them as moral beings.
I understand that.
In fact, my non-Christian friends, my atheist friends, my Buddhist friends could put me to shame morally, because I'm a wretch like everybody else is, and I can muck up as well as anybody
I'm not
else.
accusing you of moral superiority.
You're not.
Yeah.
You're not. But the moment you mention these differences, now having said that, if we can look at each other respectfully and regard each other as of infinite value made in the image of God, then we can discuss the differences. Now, let me put it to you, and I think it will partially answer your question. My Jewish friends, of whom I have many, believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends, of whom I have many, believe that he didn't die. I believe that he both died and rose again. Those three are mutually exclusive. So how do you decide it? You have to decide it on the basis of evidence. And in the end, every person must make up their own mind. Now, what I discover in discussing your question is the only people that have difficulty with it are people who don't adhere to any religion. I find that my people, my Muslim friends, Jewish friends, and so on, admit this because that is what they believe. And that's very important, that we realize that Christianity, out of it, the religions of the world won't agree with each other. And I know of no other way to approach this question but on the basis of evidence. But let it be evidence out on the table that doesn't carry with it the aspersion that you're worse than me. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I do understand what you mean. And look, people might want to pick up on that. But I wanted to take you back to a part of your speech when you said that theism and atheism aren't equal, and you spoke about your faith in your wife, and which I don't doubt, and your faith in your plane's ability to get you here. It's equally arguable, though, isn't it? If you look at your wife, at you, we can make a host of assumptions about your background, about your track record. You can build up, actually, a mathematical probability that the two of you will be faithful to each other and will stay together, in the same way you can build up a mathematical probability that the plane will get here. Well, you can. I mean, but behavioural scientists make those sort of assumptions about people all the time.
Yes, they do, but I find them entirely unconvincing. But let's.
But are they not? That's okay. But are they not more provable than your simple? I mean, I suppose you accuse Dawkins of being a reductionist, and you're saying,
he admits to being a reductionist. I don't accuse him of it. That's
okay.
That's his view.
Aren't they more? There are more postulates. There's more evidence. There are more assumptions you can make about both your wife and the plane. There's far more proof and things you can touch, predict, and prove than there is in a simple belief in a God.
But it's not a simple belief. I mean, it's a belief based on evidence. I don't see any difference in believing the result of mathematical equations and the whole business that mathematics can actually be done. What I'm claiming is a much deeper thing, that if you take the atheist route, you're undermining the very rationality that allows you to do mathematics. That's why I find it totally incredible.
So
perhaps I'm not understanding your question.
No. I mean, look, all I'm trying to do is get you to explain your views. The Dawkins position that you cannot disprove the existence of God, but you can mount a case that there's a very, very low probability that there is a God. That so much of the world is observable, so much of the world is verifiable, yet there is nothing provable and verifiable about your conception of a God. Why is that so? Why is that in your view
just let me take, there are three things there at least that you're talking about. The probability of God. Well, what's the probability that you exist? Very small. But you do exist. At least I hope you're convinced of that, yes? The point is, Raphael, that calculating probabilities is pointless in a way because they're all low. The question is, are you actual? Is there any evidence that Rafael Epstein is actual?
No,
and I think there is, ladies and gentlemen. Now, exactly the same is true. You said the probability is low. It may be antecedently, although a lot of people would disagree with that on the basis of God, that if you factor the evident fine-tuning of the universe into the probability mix, that increases the probability of God. That's Bayes' theorem and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's a certain weight attaches to that. But you see, you say there's nothing I can prove about God. Oh, yes, there is, sir. There's the intellectual side. But, for example, let me get right down to brass tacks. Christ claims to be able to forgive people, to be able to transform their lives by giving them what he calls eternal life, if they will trust him. I've seen so many people's lives transformed by doing that. Now, of course, you can psychologize it out of existence, but the point is it's a testable claim.
But you don't need psychology for that either. I mean, they could all be advantages, evolutionary, adaptive advantages, couldn't they? All of that behavior helps further the collective. But that is equally, if not more, provable than what you're saying.
I don't think so. That's an evolution of the gaps. Unless you have a mechanism that shows those things, evolution, as even a Nobel Prize winner recently has said, Robert Laughlin, is an empty word. What did it? Evolution. But where's your mechanism? Where's your operation? And again, I would want to say that
the mechanism is self-evident, isn't it? Morality, altruism. If I believe that God will give me eternal life, I will be kinder to those around me. I will provide for my children. I mean, those things are all far more observable in many ways and provable than whether or not I exist.
But that's a good thing. Isn't that evidence that the Christianity is true rather than it's false?
Well, it could just be evidence that those things are all adaptations to evolution that maximize my DNA's chance of survival.
If you're working on the basis of DNA's chance of survival, you wouldn't...
Again, Dawkins, the selfish gene.
You wouldn't... Oh, I know, yeah. But do many people believe in the selfish gene anymore? That's a metaphor, and it's a very misleading metaphor. Dawkins' selfish gene has led himself to the edge of an abyss where he points out that we are the only people capable of rebelling against the selfish genes that are driving us on. And as a number of atheists, not Christians, have pointed out, where is this immaterial principle that can help us rebel against the selfish genes if we're products of our selfish genes? You see, the trouble is, this is what I call a kind of commissar argument. I get it often in the most trivial form. You say that because you're an Irishman, you know? Yeah. You say that because you're a woman. Now notice what's happening there. What's happening is if you can give a causal chain to explain what you're doing, you've emptied it of meaning. Because what that amounts to, that criticism, is what you're saying has no meaning because I can give you a reason you're saying it. You're an Irishman. And you need to watch that. Because if you start reducing it simply reductionistic to physics and chemistry, that's exactly what you're doing. You're emptying the universe of meaning. But then you're emptying the whole grounds of your own discussion. And it becomes meaningless. So we end up in gibberish, I'm afraid.
I want you to expand a bit on the why you don't, or why you discount the who created the creator question. Because again, a lot of atheists would argue that so much is explicable by laws of physics, the theory of evolution, those things. So for them, therefore, that question is crucial. Can you just expand again on why that question is not, I think, not relevant, either not relevant or something, a question you'd like to dismiss?
The question, who created the creator, is a question about created creators. And the God that created the universe is eternal. He wasn't created. I'm simply saying a fact. The question doesn't apply to him. He's not a created creator. But I think that Richard Dawkins and a number of others want to believe that and push God into the realm of the Greek gods that are created in that way by human imagination and so on. I'm just making a strictly logical point. And I find that most people take that. Now, there's a related thing that you may have in the back of your mind, I'm not sure. And that is...
There's so many things in the back of my mind.
What? Well, I'm making a generous assumption. That Richard Dawkins says, look, twisting that slightly, he says, you having the idea of God as a creator is silly because God is by definition now more complex than the thing you're explaining. Therefore, he's no explanation at all. Now, that's related to it. I don't know whether you had that in mind. But that's a non-starter as well, because, as I put to him, I think in one of our encounters, I find a book, The God Delusion, and it's pretty complicated. It's about 400 pages long. So I ask about its origin. I find it originates in the infinitely more complicated mind of Richard Dawkins. So I discard that, because the explanation is more complicated than the thing I'm explaining. And the point of that is this, that explanations often run from the simple to the complex, and we're delighted as scientists when that can happen. The one place it doesn't happen is where language is involved.
I want to get to a few of the questions here
please
in a moment,
do.
but I just wanted to ask you one more thing. I'm interested in your personal conception. You mentioned the eternal God.
Yes.
Which is clearly a very different way of looking at the world to the creator question. What does that mean to you? Does that mean that you're happy with the idea that something always has been and always will be, and it's that being that when you unveil something like, the predictions of gravity, calculus, quantum mechanics, all you are doing is stripping back some of the paint on the things that are eternally there? I'm just interested in your personal conception of how the eternal God fits together with those scientific theories and,
Well, I think to a large extent that's true, that God is the imaginator behind the universe. He's the creator. And to quote Kepler, we're thinking God's thoughts after him. But I think because I'm a pure mathematician, I go further than that. And I think that God has genuinely given us the capacity to create. So some of the mathematics is discovered, some of it's invented. And
but
perhaps
by
it's because I'm yes. And
which stuff did we invent?
Oh, well, the kind of stuff I do, we invent.
Oh, okay. okay.
Abstract group theory.
Is that because Newton and the others found all the good stuff and you've got to sort of
Well, possibly we're tinged with deep jealousy about what these people had done. Wouldn't you love to have discovered, as Pythagoras did? I'd love to have that there's an infinite number of primes. His proof is beautiful and simple. Those are the elegant things in mathematics.
Indeed. Look, there's a good question here, and I suppose I'm interested too in your thoughts on the motivations of people involved in the debate.
Yes.
Science versus religion discussions always become so polarized. How can we discuss this with each other without so much antagonism?
By doing what we're doing right now.
What do you think?
By being, yes, it's a very important question, Raphael. Let me put it this way. Debate, I discover, is moving out of mode, out of fashion, particularly in the United States, where I've done quite a few big debates. And it's very interesting. I was recently debating an atheist philosopher, and he wrote to me in advance, and he said, I'm so thrilled you don't want a debate, you want a moderated discussion. And many more people want, look, let's get the ideas out into the public space. The people are intelligent enough to decide, and let's do it without rancor and bitterness. And I think that's perfectly possible. So when I go into even a debate, and I've had many of those, one just round the corner with Peter Singer in the town hall, I want to go into it in as friendly a way as possible, and I want to come out of it in as friendly a way as possible. My measure of it is, I don't go to win. What I want to do is to try to put a credible argument for my position, and allow the other person to do exactly the same thing, and let the people judge, and be able to part with a firm handshake. And if we did that more, I think, the trouble is, in many countries, including my own, it's not a level playing field. You rarely get that opportunity. But I'm glad we're getting it now.
Do you think, I'm interested in this is a very selfish question, because I often feel that the discussions I have on my show every day end up being far more rancorous than I would like them to be. And I know, having lived in England, the sorts of debates that are in the public there. Do you think that on the whole, the debates about this issue are beneficial? Do you think most people come away from it with a greater understanding either of their own or of the position of the other side? I mean, I just wonder if the glass is half full or half empty.
Enormously beneficial, but you're now going to accuse me of extreme bias.
No,
well, all I can judge from it is the thousands of emails I get from all kinds of people.
Well, so remove yourself from it then. All the other discussions you see about it, do you see them actually having a positive impact?
Well, some do. They educate people. They help people to think. You see, one of the great things for which I'm thankful to Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens and the rest of them is they put God back on the agenda. They really have. I mean, look at this room tonight. And everywhere I go, it's exactly the same. Thousands of people coming.
Figures go the other way.
They're interested.
I know in Australia, my understanding of the figures in Australia are around attendance at a house of worship and belief in a God. My impression was that those figures were very much on the way down.
Oh, they are on the way down. But you see, a lot of it is attendance at a house of worship is a very different thing.
I agree.
From wrestling with the God question. But it's an important thing, because I'm going to admit something now straight. The biggest reason given in our country for departure from the churches is they don't answer our questions. And I take that very seriously. And I'm ashamed of the fact that Christians have got that reputation of being anti-intellectual, not answering questions, when, if you look back, the foundation of Oxford, Cambridge, and many of the world's greatest universities, they were all religious foundations. That's where the thinking was done. That's where the debates were. And before the Middle Ages even, there were massive discussions going on all over Europe. I'd like to get back to that. And I think these discussions are enormously important, because many young people, particularly students, they're getting a bit fed up with the sort of materialism that's been thrown at them. They're also, if I might say so, getting fed up with the strident nature of some of what's called the new atheism. So now we've got the new atheism. I don't know whether you've come across it, have you?
It's new neo, isn't it?
No, the new atheism.
The
new atheism is, look, let's take the best out of all religions, but please let's not do God.
Okay.
Well, of course, that's, from my perspective, a hopeless situation. But the reaction is against this kind of militant, let's destroy religion, and so on, which some very leading figures in the world have said. Steven Weinberg, Nobel Prize winner. Perhaps the best thing we scientists can do for this generation is to obliterate religion.
I want to ask you more actually about, I suppose, faith in the public space, but let me try to get through a few of these questions. In various other talks that you've made, you seem to have varying views of evolution. I gather that you believe in an old universe and that evolution of molecules to man cannot be explained through natural selection and mutations. Could you explain what your opinion is on Genesis, how the world was formed? Was it 6 days, staggered evolution? Maybe the way to go is to ask you about natural selection and mutations, what your view is of them, and then we'll get into the 6 days question.
So there's 6 questions there, aren't there?
Well, that's 3.
Which one do you want me to take first?
Natural selection and mutations, your view on that, and then how does it fit into the 6 days in the Bible idea?
Well, fine, Raphael. Number one, I'm not a biologist, but I do try to make up for it by reading as much as I can. Natural selection, mutation clearly do something. Just look around this room. I mean, selecting can even happen in a meeting like this, as you may well know, if you work it out. And genetically, a third of us have got mutations that will probably kill us. What Darwin saw was brilliant. He saw that, for example, the finch beaks in the Galapagos Islands, when there's a drought, the bigger beaks are favored, and so the finches with bigger beaks survive. Of course, it went back to what it was before. So mutation and natural selection do something. Where I have difficulty, and I'm afraid I'm a mathematician, and we have a bit of a track record, whether we're believers in God or not, of having difficulty with seeing this natural process as being creative, in the sense that it generates new information. And I think the evidence is not there. And
isn't it creative in that it creates new beings and new organisms?
Well, it varies on the theme. Means? All of us in here are human beings, I expect. And we're very different. There are variations on the theme. Natural selection varies the theme. As somebody has put it, it can explain a little bit about the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. And what I notice...
But it does explain the beginning of life on Earth?
No, it does not.
So you don't believe in that part of the evolutionary...
No, neither does Dawkins. He did for a long time in The Blind Watchmaker. He said that natural selection, which Darwin discovered, etc., the blind automatic process, you know, the heart thing on about page 5, explains the existence and variation of all life. He's withdrawn that in his more recent book because he's realized something that was said long ago by Theodosius Dobzhansky, one of the greatest evolutionary biologists, that pre-biological evolution is a contradiction in terms. Natural selection and mutation, whatever they do, can only get going when you've got life already there. So they cannot, by definition, be used to explain life. Nobody thinks that.
I can't say that I have read The God Delusion and The Blind Watchmaker with the
Blessed
same
art thou.
well, I have read them both. I've read them both, but I haven't read them with the same precision. But I can't believe that Richard Dawkins doesn't believe that the very simple design of the universe that has no designer accounts for the beginning of life, at the very beginning of life.
Oh, that's a different matter. What you asked me, did evolution, mutation, and natural selection. He admits in his book, you can see, it's called The Greatest Show on Earth, that, well, he admits we know virtually nothing about the origin of life.
I suppose, actually, I mean, I'm more interested in your view of the beginning. I mean, we can all read Dawkins.
My view of the beginning is that the universe is not a closed system of cause and effect, and that the biblical view, which you referred to, is utterly brilliant insight, because it concentrates in its limited language and its very short description on the fundamental thing that's only recently been discovered, and that is that information is the key to everything. This is an information-rich universe. At every one of the 10 trillion cells of our bodies, there's an information-rich macromolecule, DNA. And you see, the Genesis story, let's strip it down to its essentials. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So it didn't generate itself from nothing. That's another whole track that we could deal with. And I think you had Lawrence Krauss in Australia last year claiming that it came from nothing. It didn't come from nothing. They have a problem there. God created it. He's an intelligent God, but he did it by, and God said, and God said, and God said. That's very simple language, but it's referring to something very profound, and that is that the universe is not a closed system. It is built up by a series, not many, of inputs from outside, and God spoke. It's as if Genesis is unpacking the very first statement in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. Okay. In other words, its information is prior to mass energy. Now, the reductionist, materialist view, of course, is the exact opposite, that information comes out of mass energy. The problem with that is this, that physicists are increasingly recognizing that, first of all, information is a fundamental quantity, and, of course, information is not only invisible, it's not material. So we have the great irony of science in the 21st century. We're in the information age, and information conceptually is immaterial. So that's the end of materialism.
Isn't information actually, though, built up fundamentally by its physical components? I mean, there is a very solid scientific backing to the idea that DNA comes from a more simple organism, no?
But that's like saying that the writing on that sheet there is built up by the simple scientific components of the paper and ink.
Well, it is.
It isn't. That writing there that you recognize as having meaning, you cannot explain to me the semiotic nature of those letters in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. You cannot reduce the information contained in City Bible Forum to the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. You cannot do it. And people are increasingly recognizing that. The problem is, if you wear a reductionist hat, you've got to be able to do it.
Why can't I reduce it to a series of physical and chemical questions?
Well, you try.
Well, I know that the light
when
bounces.
You've written the book, I'll read it with considerable interest.
I don't have time to write the book now. But
Michael,
I know, but you know what I'm saying. You know that there's a whole lot of, there's the light bouncing off that. Some of it light goes in, some of the light is reflected. I am taught a whole series of things.
But what's that
from
got
the
to
moment
do with
I
the
am born.
meaning of it? You see, you're back to what Paul Kinghorn was saying. Michael Polanyi saw this years ago, and you probably read him when you were doing history and philosophy of science. He pointed out that, look, if you take certain kind of soil, it can determine to a certain extent the strength of a brick that you can produce with it. But the brick doesn't determine the shape of the house you build with it. The shape of the house you build with it doesn't determine the shape of the street. and it doesn't determine the shape of the town. There are hierarchies which require an informational input from outside, and that occurs in lots of places. And that's increasingly the thing, and this is what Thomas Nagel is getting at. You cannot reduce the mental to the physical. And we have forgotten that, I think. C.S. Lewis pointed it out in the 1940s, as I said. And it's now coming back full circle, and it's causing, just Google it and see what happened in cyberspace when the new atheists found out that Thomas Nagel was undermining their pet theories. Marvelous stuff.
I want to go to a few more of the texts if I can. Does your belief in God limit where you think science should and can go? Say research in genetic engineering or the creation of intelligent life through scientific means?
It limits it when it comes to violating the concept of a human being. In other words, let me reverse that. And the positive thing, of course, is what I said in my lecture. Remember, historically, we owe modern science to Christianity. It wasn't against science. Indeed, I should add to that, that the fundamental scientific discipline is taxonomy, is naming things. It was God commanded that according to the Bible. So God is pro-science and he's pro-biology. Isn't that interesting? So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. If it is true that human beings are made in the image of God, then we need to be careful what we do to them.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what you're saying.
Well, what I'm saying is this, that if, for example, we have the power to disrupt the germline and change the specification of all generations after us, we need to be extremely careful. C.S. Lewis warned of this, because in the end, what we would produce are artifacts, not free human beings. And we could be at risk of destroying what is essentially human. That's all I'm saying. There are bound to be limits, ethical limits. Every single laboratory has an ethical committee around the world.
I'm not
so
saying,
yeah,
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is what I think.
Maybe I misunderstood you.
No, I just think there's the second part of that question perhaps you haven't addressed. I'm interested. How far do you think human beings are capable of going? I'm not beyond the ethical boundary. What do you think?
Do you mean
because of your belief in
create
God,
life?
Well, artificial intelligence means intelligent life through scientific means. So I suppose both creating life and also artificial intelligence. I just wonder, your belief in our actual physical capacity to create that, how's that influenced by your belief in God?
Well, I think there are a lot of questions that you need to answer before that. What do you mean by artificial intelligence? Because what we create with programmable computers, and they are the start, there's a huge debate raging out there, and you must be aware of it, whether they really do think or they don't think and all this kind of thing. My naive assumption, and nothing I've read has contradicted it so far, is that robotics is very unlikely to produce something that can independently think and create and so on. It can process much faster than we can. But whether or not human beings will be able to create life biologically by Craig Venter, constructing things, they may well be able to do so. I mean, I don't know. I'm not God. I don't know what people are capable of doing. And it's obviously always much more than we think they can. So I'd be a crazy man to answer your question.
Not my question, just some generous person out there. This is a good one. Since according to incremental evolution, there's no point in time that humans became a species, I assume that means a discrete moment in time. How can there suddenly be a human with a soul created in the image of God, but his parents were not? I suppose that's really asking for your view on incremental evolution.
Yes, well, I'm sharing the view of an increasing number of biologists, that incremental evolution doesn't produce the big changes. But behind that question is something far more serious, and I'll address that head on. Because the corollary of the universe not being a closed system is that I'm not only open to the idea, but I believe it to be true, that human beings are a special creation. They didn't come about by incremental creation from anything below them at all. And I think that the Bible goes out of its way to point that out. That the very interesting thing is, however you regard the Genesis story, just let's think about what it actually says. It points out that one of the fascinating things that God said to the man was, it's not good for you to be alone. And then there follows an almost humorous account, if you look at it in its context, about God bringing the animals to the man to see what he would name them. And he gave them names. That must have been a very lengthy process. And then it adds at the end, and here's the humorous bit, but for man, there was not found a companion suitable for him. That is among the animals. According to the Genesis account, the very first lesson humanity was taught was they were not continuous with the animals. It's almost as if the book anticipated a contemporary debate.
I know.
And therefore, now people say, but that's absurd. You can't possibly believe that. Half a minute. The origin of the universe is an accepted singularity where the laws of physics break down. Now, I'm a Christian, as you know, and fundamental to my belief is that Jesus rose from the dead. That's another singularity. A third singularity that I believe occurred, to refer to your earlier conversation, is the origin of life. I don't think life came from non-life by a series of incremental random things. You don't have evolution anyway. As far as Scripture goes, very little is said, but what is said is highly significant. On day 3 of the sequence, God speaks more than once. And his second speech is to make the distinction between the inorganic and the organic. Let me word it very carefully. You don't get from the inorganic, from non-life to life, according to Scripture, without "and God said." Something happens from outside the system. Similarly, on day 6, you don't get from animals to man without "and God said." So that's one way of looking at it. Now, of course, science, in a way, can say very little about that. Because
there's
if
a fossil
God...
record that backs up a lot of evolution, isn't there?
Oh, there's a fossil record that you could arrange things in a hierarchy, but you can arrange cars in a hierarchy. That doesn't mean they descended from one another. It means they could have, been part of a common...
The fossil record is not that arbitrary. I mean, there are gaps in the fossil record, but it's far more verifiable than the sort of thing
But you know that Darwin's tree has been unplanted and turned upside down. I was just reading about it. But the idea of there being a tree of life is being shot to pieces at the moment. I can only listen to the biologists, Rafael. But the point is, even accepting what you say, that you can, as a mathematician, I can take any set of things and build them into some sort of hierarchy. And you can do that with fossil creatures. And you can say, well, that looks simpler than that, that looks more complex than that. But that doesn't mean you've provided a mechanism that moves from the lower level of complexity to the higher one. Until you've done that and can demonstrate that, you've simply got an empty word, evolution. What I'm claiming is this, that whatever natural selection, mutation do, and that is a very big question, of course, a very interesting scientific question. Is there a genetic homeostasis? Is there a limit to what can be produced by a given gene pool at a given level? As, for example, Pierre Grasset, who was the doyen of French biology in a time past, claimed? Right. Or can it give all these incremental additive changes? What I'm claiming is this: you can arrange them in a hierarchy, but that could be a result of one, common descent. It could be a result of partially common descent and common design. Just like you could arrange cars from the T4 to a modern Jaguar in a hierarchy, they're not descended from each other because cars have to have a certain common design. It's caused by design engineering. Let me add another little thing in here. Suppose you and I are brilliant biologists and we're working in a lab, Rafael Epstein and John Lennox, and we discover a brilliant genetic modification for food. 1,000 years go by and our work is lost. And then somebody comes across the plants that we've developed. And they're neo-Darwinians. They'll fit that into a neo-Darwinian sequence. Of course they will. But they won't know that that new strand was a product of intelligent design, will they? Because through the glasses, the lenses that they're applying to the situation, your work and my work is invisible to them. Likewise, if you assume that everything can be naturalistically explained, you're bound to keep on going that. And I say, well, bless your heart, keep on going. But I think that if it is true that there's an input from outside, then you would expect certain things to happen. You would expect the gap to grow wider as science advances, not to close. That's exactly what's happened with the origin of life. They thought they'd solved it in 1953 with the Miller-Urey experiment. They didn't realize, they hadn't a ghost of a notion that the problem was not getting the basic amino acids. The problem was getting things in the right order, in a semiotic order of the DNA code. And now people say nobody knows essentially anything about the origin of life. That's exactly what I would expect to happen. It's no proof, but it's what I would expect to happen if intelligence is necessary.
There aren't a lot of the hypotheticals you're using to illustrate your argument and the assumptions you're using ignoring a lot of the proof. I mean, most of those who deal with evolutionary biology would argue that you're dismissing a lot of the evidence they're able to display to prove that biology is far more coherent than you presented today.
Let me read to you James Shapiro, who's just written a book. He's the leading molecular biologist at the University of Chicago, Evolution, A View from the 21st Century. As many professional and popular press articles attest, the accidental stochastic nature of mutations is still the prevailing and widely accepted wisdom on the subject. This insistence on randomness and accident is not surprising. It springs from a determination in the 19th and 20th centuries by biologists to reject the role of a supernatural agent. The DNA record definitely does not support, this man's an atheist, does not support the slow accumulation of random gradual changes transmitted by restricted patterns of vertical descent. Little evidence fits unequivocally with the theory that evolution occurs through the gradual accumulation of numerous slight modifications. Clear evidence exists for abrupt events. Now, the interesting thing is...
But isn't part of that evidence about things self-organizing, not about some sort of external influence?
But we're talking about something totally different now. You're going back to the origin of life. This is talking about once you've got life.
No, I mean along the evolutionary trail, part of evolutionary biological
the
thought is that
evolutionary
things
trail
self-organize.
cannot begin until you have life, unless you change your definition of the word evolution. Okay. And that's what happens. What I'm pointing out here is, I'm not a biologist, but what fascinates me is reading increasingly in the last 2 or 3 years statements like this coming from some of the leading biologists in the world who are seriously questioning established wisdom. Now, they haven't solved the problem. They don't claim to. So I think a lot
is that
up
really
for grabs.
seriously questioning established wisdom? Because I remember I spoke
Well, the
to you at the back.
established wisdom is the gradual accumulation. He's quoting Darwin, you
But
see.
there's been a debate for at least 20 or 30 years in evolutionary science about what creates the sudden, evolution doesn't move at a steady space.
And it's getting more difficult. That's what I'm saying. Okay. And Lynn Margulis, who died unfortunately recently, professor at Boston and in Oxford, said neo-Darwinism is dead. So I'm reacting as a non-biologist. You've got to have a biologist here. But what I'm saying is popular accepted wisdom of the blind watchmaker kind appears to be dying out. Now, I want to say something else. My belief in God doesn't depend on the truth or falsity of a biological theory. You see, this is important. God can do it any way he likes. The question as to how he did it is essentially a scientific question. So we need to separate those two things. You cannot logically deduce atheism from neo-Darwinism. There are many people who believe in neo-Darwinism who are Christian, who believe in God. What I'm saying is this: as a scientist, I'm querying two things. I've long since seen that God can do it any way he likes. But secondly, what I'm saying is, if you're going to argue anything from evolution, you have to A, be able to say, logically, you can deduce atheism from it. That's logically false. But B, that it has to carry the weight that's put on it. Now, what's becoming increasingly clear to my mind is it's not doing that.
Okay. Let me go to a few of these questions. Sorry. It's a good one. If we're made in the image of God, why is it that we are so flawed biologically?
Well, a bomb has hit us, hasn't it? In a way. Flawed biologically, that is, we're damaged. Well,
Flawed, biologically. Is that different? I'm not sure.
well, we're flawed morally as well as biologically. And
I suspect the questioner means both.
yes, I suspect so too. So we'll think about both of those. Well, again, you were talking earlier about truth, correspondence to reality, and coherence. I think we've got to first listen to the biblical picture before we can judge it. And the biblical picture tells us that human beings, the Genesis story, and I'm interested, you did pursue that with me earlier, but there we are. We passed it by. The days of Genesis and so on, and I'm happy to pass it by.
No, you're not.
We come to the... I'm very happy to pass it by.
Let's answer this person's question.
But the question here, what we're told is that human beings were given free will. And the minimalist description in Genesis is very powerful. The idea that human beings were allowed to eat of every tree in the garden except one. And of course that prohibition meant that they were free to eat it, but they weren't permitted to eat it. That's the basic minimum for being a moral being. And human beings decided to believe a lie, that God was against them. They still believe it, of course, which is a major reason for not believing in God. He's out there to spoil our fun. Christopher Hitchens had this marvelous description of God as a North Korean dictator in the sky. You've probably heard that. Always looking to see if anybody's having fun and spoiling it. But God invented all the colors. He's the one that gave us our brain, our mind, our creative abilities. But humans believed the lie and they rebelled against God. And they brought sin into the world, and death came through sin. And it appears to have had a cataclysmic effect at a whole lot of different levels. And I think that at least is part of the reason for the flaw in humanity. It's certainly the reason for the moral flaw. We're damaged people. And we've got to face that damage. But then what you've got to put against that damage and that flawedness that we all recognize, I recognize it in me, my wife recognizes it in me even more, is that because I didn't engineer the problem myself, my parents were good parents, but they weren't perfect. They were flawed. And so were their parents. And so there's a long chain. One of the reasons I'm a Christian, and I must bring this in here because it's relevant to your question, is that the solution measures up to the problem. Because I didn't engineer the problem in the first place, I'm not going to be able to solve it. And that is the reason given in the Christian revelation for God coming into the world and doing something about it. And that brings us to very big things, like the death and resurrection of Christ, that Christ claiming his name is Jesus. He shall save his people from their sins. And therefore, there's an answer to this. Now, the final point I would make is this is a fractured universe. And we're always going to have questions. We see traces of beauty, and we see traces of evil. I arrived in Christchurch, New Zealand, 2 days after the earthquake. Saw the cathedral. Could see the remains of beauty, but could see that an earthquake had hit it. And life presents itself to us like that. And that's one of the hardest problems we face, but we need to face it.
Just briefly, why are we flawed biologically, if as you believe?
Well, it seems to me that I can't get round the idea that the actual moral rebellion had biological consequences of some kind or other.
Oh, okay. According to Genesis, God created plants and trees on earth before the sun and the moon. Yep, science at its best. How do you explain that?
Well, according to an interpretation of Genesis, that is the case.
Okay.
The appearance
just
of the
poorly
sun...
translated or something?
Not at all, no. And Origen, in the 3rd or 4th century, saw the problem. He saw, and of course I believe the writer saw this. You see, if you read a document like that talks about days, that says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which presumably includes the sun, and you begin to read it seriously, you can rapidly come to some conclusions. Number one, Hebrew as a language has several past tenses. And the first two verses of Genesis 1, in the beginning God created, are in a different tense from the sequence of days. According to the scholars, of which I'm not one, but I read what they say, and I've consulted them, the difference in tense means that the first statement refers to something occurring before the events described in the sequence of days. How long before is not said. So Genesis says nothing about the age of the earth. That's point number one, just to deflect that. Yep. Point number two is, when you read day 1, day 2, day 3, and then you suddenly discover the sun, you say, hey, have a moment. And Origen saw it. What is going on here? Because our concept of day depends on the existence of the sun. But the point made, if you look at it carefully, is that the sun and the moon and the stars appear for signs. They're visible. Now, go back to the scientific model. This Earth is quite hot in the middle. It's not so hot on the surface except in Australia in summer. But it was very hot. And you either have to say, right, the sun was made on day 4. This is nonsensical because what were the days before that? Or you say, let's look at it carefully to see what kind of multivalency there is in the basic Hebrew words that's used here. And serious scholars have said that the words can easily mean that what happened in day 4 was that the sun became visible. It was there at the beginning, as verse 1 says. But the cloud cover,
isn't that with the heat and choosing? I mean, there's always a biblical authority you can draw on. And I mean, I'm interested in extrapolating, to a wider reading of the Bible. I've done my fair share of Talmud and Bible classes for my students. I mean, there's always an authority you can draw on to emphasize one part of the Bible and dismiss another part. We decide that, we move on from the values of a former age, so we dismiss those parts of the Bible. We discover there's a logical inconsistency, so we dismiss it. It's very easy to pick and choose your Bible.
But I'm not doing that. I'm absolutely not doing that. I'm not taking one part of the Bible on an authority and dismissing another part of the Bible. What I'm doing is looking at it in light of our experience of the world and of science and making an assessment of two possibilities, one of which is illogical and postulates a whole lot of other things, another of which makes perfect sense. That's all I'm doing. Let me give you another example of this, and you can come back on me. If we'd been having this discussion in the 1500s, you and I, you wouldn't have been talking about the age of the earth or anything like that. You'd probably been pushing me on whether the earth moves or not, wouldn't you? This upstart Galileo, you see, coming up with the idea that the earth moves. And you might have, had you been doing your Talmudic studies and studies of Tanakh, you might be saying, but look, the Psalms say God has set the earth upon its foundations that it cannot be moved. So there you are, the earth doesn't move. And of course, that was the whole issue with Galileo. But it didn't come from the church only. It came, first of all, from the medieval philosophers, who were all Aristotelians, and so they believed that the earth was fixed in the middle of the universe. Now, you see, there's nobody in this room, I suspect, that believes that the earth is geometrically fixed.
Oh, don't make too many assumptions.
What?
Nothing.
Well, perhaps down in Australia, but I was granting you a generous spirit. The point is,
you don't need the people who call
what we've come to see, but what we've come to see is when the Psalms talked about it being fixed, you can read it literalistically, but you don't have to. You can read it as a metaphor for something real at a higher level. And we now know, which they didn't know, that the Earth's in a stable orbit round the sun. But that has to do with an inverse square law of gravity, the existence of gas giants, the moon, and so on. Now, you might say, oh, but that's special pleading. You're using science to interpret the Bible. But we do that all the time. I mean, we use nature, if you think of science as a study of nature, to interpret anything. there's nothing different in doing it in Scripture. So all I'm doing is saying, if you look at that, the sun appearing on the fourth day, that makes a lot of sense and fits in with what we know. Saying the sun was created on the fourth day contradicts Scripture itself, because it talks about days before the sun. That's not using one part of the Bible to dismiss another.
Look, someone still feels like we've skipped over the 6 days. But I am curious, because one image keeps coming to my mind is that, I don't know if you saw the Russell Crowe Noah film, which is flawed, but one of the, to say the least, but one of the great parts of the film, to be honest, is when he tells that story and fits it into a sort of a more, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, Big Bang view of the creation of the universe. Do you see some way of wrapping that 6-day story around the explanation of the Big Bang and the formation of the planet?
But the Big Bang is a label and a mystery. Fred Hoyle coined it as a joke, as you know, because he believed in a steady-state universe. The Big Bang simply says there was a beginning. Genesis has been saying that for centuries. That's the irony, as I pointed out to some people at CERN not long ago, that here is science in the 1960s coming up with the idea there was a beginning. The Bible's been saying it for thousands of years. And I said to them, gentlemen, you know, if you'd taken this ancient book a bit more seriously, you might have looked for evidence of it earlier. There's absolutely no contradiction with the standard model of physics and cosmology that says space-time had a beginning, and Genesis that says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. None whatsoever.
I'm not saying there is a contradiction. I'm interested in your perception of it, because as you said,
but
the laws of gravity are a great predictor. If you have the Big Bang, you can use the laws of gravity to extrapolate, and a whole lot of the other laws of physics.
Of course you can.
You can use that to get... Yeah. So is that an explanation for the 6, or is that...
No, wait a minute. We haven't come to the 6 days yet.
Okay.
The first thing to realize is that people get confused, and they don't realize that the statement in Genesis at the beginning is detached from the days. So the irony is, you see, no matter what you believe about the days, they don't imply a young earth necessarily. You can read it that way if you like, but the whole point of the Hebrew is in the beginning was at the beginning at some indefinite time of the past. But now the days are interesting. Many people argue the word yom in Hebrew means 24 hours everywhere it occurs in Genesis, but the very first mention of it doesn't. God called the light day and the darkness he called night. How long is that? It's less than 24, isn't it? Even in Australia. So the very first use of the word draws attention to its linguistic multivalency. Daytime, day. And there was evening and morning, one day, Yom Ahat. There was one day, okay? Well, the Hebrew scholars, you know probably better than I do, argue about whether that's a normal day or it isn't. Let's accept that it is a 24-hour day, okay? So that's two meanings. Third meaning is that on day 7, God rests. There is no formula, and there was evening and morning, day 7. And most people for centuries have seen that as important, that God rests from creating. Strictly so-called creating has stopped. God is now upholding the universe. He's not creating anymore. So that rest day has lasted until the present and beyond. So there's a very long day. Then, to add to that, in chapter 2, verse 4, the word is when God created the heavens and the earth, but in Hebrew, it's in the day that. And it's like saying, in my young day in Cambridge, we had to be in college at 11 o'clock at night. You would have never thought of saying, is that Tuesday or Thursday? It's the period of time when you were there. So in Genesis 1 and 2, you've 4 distinct meanings of the word day. That reminds me it's very sophisticated, but now it gets fascinating. Because you see, people look at this and they say, well, if they are days of 24 hours, they must be days of 1 earth week. But that's an assumption that's not warranted when you begin to see how the grammar works. If they were days of 1 earth week, you'd expect them either to have the definite article, ha, or no article. Hebrew is the definite no, you know that. But the interesting thing is in the sequence, it's Yom Ahat, day 1, not the first day, but it's the 6th and the 7th. It changes. Now that begins to open up logical possibilities that what it is saying is that these are God's creation days. In the beginning, God created. When was that? It doesn't say. So it could easily be 13.8 billion years ago. Then, and God said, didn't take him long to say, and I don't mean that facetiously. God speaks information in, that begins to unfold. Then God speaks again, day 2. When is day 2? After day 1. How long? I don't know. In other words, it's perfectly logically possible that what we have is what they're claimed to be, a sequence of creation acts where God speaks. They may take a very long time to unfold, and their unfoldings may overlap. Now, of course, if we look back at any kind of record that might be left of that, what we'd expect is the sudden appearance of new levels of complexity, which is exactly what we do find. So that's one way of reading it. I wouldn't die for that, even though some people might like me to after this is over. But it seems to me there's a perfectly intelligible way of reading it. Now, the big objection to that is, oh, here, that's far too sophisticated and far too complex. But I could say exactly the same about the moving earth. It's far too sophisticated and complex to understand the psalm that says the earth is fixed, that it shall not be moved, in terms of a fundamental stability. But we've long since conquered that. The only thing I would point out is it took 1,700 years to sort that one out. So the age of the earth, well, it's taking a long time too. So I'd sum it up by saying this. You can read Scripture as if it said the earth doesn't move, but you don't have to. You can read Scripture as if it said the earth was young, but you don't have to.
I'm just curious too, I've always loved chaos theory because it seems to be a beautifully elegant theory. I just wonder how it fits into your conception of
Well, chaos theory is a misnomer because it's a highly deterministic theory. It's saying just that things are so sensitive to initial conditions that you can't actually do the measurements to sufficient accuracy. But the actual laws behind, so to speak, that become chaotic are completely
Well, it's more an observation, isn't it, that you get order where you expect chaos and chaos.
It's just a fascinating fact about the universe.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure it has any eternal significance.
Okay. Let me see if I can get through a few of these questions. Do you see a belief like the resolution, do you see, I think this is what it's saying, do you see belief in the resurrection as being anti-scientific or blind faith? Which you actually
Absolutely
referred to
not,
briefly.
but it's such an important question. I remember Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, who's passing I mourn. I got on with him very well, actually, and loved discussing with him. He made this point in a debate that we had in America, and you can see it on YouTube, I think, where he said, look, you know, this idea of the supernatural, resurrection, this is a non-starter. Because David Hume long ago pointed out that miracles are a violation of the laws of nature. We know the laws of nature. In primitive times, like the New Testament, they didn't know the laws of nature, so they could believe in these things. They are impossible to us. Now, the problem that presents me with is a double problem. It's pointless, I find, with contemporary audiences in the West, to start saying, I believe in the resurrection because this bit of evidence and that bit of evidence. They come back and say, look, I'm not interested in your evidence because the supernatural is impossible according to the laws of nature. So we need to step back to the in-principle situation, which I shall now do as briefly as possible. This is a big story, actually, but let me keep it simple.
Who knew the resurrection's being
David Hume was wrong. Let me make a provocative statement. Miracles do not violate the laws of nature. Let me illustrate it. I'm staying in a hotel up the road. So last night, I put $100 into my drawer by my bed. Tonight, I put $100. That's $200, yes? Tomorrow, I find $50. Now, have the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of Victoria? Now think about it. Somebody's put their hand in. How do I know that? Because the laws of arithmetic haven't been broken. It's my knowledge of the laws of arithmetic that tells me that somebody has put their hands into what I thought was a closed system. Now this is so important. It's due to C.S. Lewis. I'm not clever enough to think of that. And it's a very important thing. We have got a wrong idea of the laws of nature because of the word law. We confuse it with the laws of the land. Don't drive more than 40 miles an hour, or whatever it is. What are laws? They are our descriptions of what normally happens, provided nothing intervenes. But they don't prevent something coming in from the outside. Now, here's the interesting thing. If you didn't know the laws of arithmetic, well, you'd say 100 plus 100 was 200 yesterday, it's 50 today. Well, so what? And you see, this makes nonsense of Hume's claim that in the time of the New Testament, they didn't know the laws of nature. Of course they knew the laws of nature. If you don't know that it's normal for a dead body to remain in a grave, then you wouldn't be remotely surprised at Christ coming out of the grave. It's because they knew that dead bodies remain dead. And that's so again and again and again. Indeed, and here's something very interesting that has always weighed with me. There's only one scientist or quasi-scientist who writes in the New Testament. His name is Dr. Luke. And he starts his gospel by raising this question, which shows he was aware of it in the first century. He talks about a priest and his wife who are very old. The priest is in the temple. The priest is praying, so presumably he believes in prayer. He believes in God. An angel appears to him, so presumably he believes in angels. And the angel says, you're going to have a baby. And he says, nonsense. I'm too old. He knew as well as any modern gynecologist that you get too old to produce children. And the angel struck him dumb for being silly. And the reason for that is that God could do something. The point is this, that Luke, by telling us that story, goes to the heart of the objection against miracle. It's against the laws of nature. And you know, when it comes to the Christmas story, when Mary came to Joseph and said, I'm going to have a child, he didn't say, marvelous, my dear. He was determined to divorce her. Why? Because he knew exactly where babies come from. You see, it is a nonsense to say with Hume they didn't know the laws of nature. They did know them because you have to know them to recognize that here is an exception. Now, if I were claiming, when it comes to the resurrection specifically, that the resurrection of Jesus is a result of natural processes going on in the tomb 5 minutes before he rose, then it would be a violation of the laws of nature. But I'm not claiming that at all. I'm claiming that God, by his power, raised Jesus from the dead. It was an injection of power and energy from outside a closed system. The laws can say nothing about that. Newton's laws of motion can predict to a certain extent, if I hit a billiard ball with a cue, what's going to happen. But if you just reach over the table, lift the ball up, you're introducing something new from outside. Newton's laws will continue to work. You haven't broken them. So it seems to me that this is a completely false idea that miracles break the laws of nature. So in that sense, as a scientist, I'm recognizing the fact that God has built regularities into the universe. We describe them mathematically by our laws of nature. God is the lawgiver, but God, as the lawgiver, is not a prisoner of the laws. Remember, the laws don't cause anything. Newton's laws of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People with cues do that. But people have some idea of breaking laws as if they're causes. They're not. They are our descriptions of what normally happens. So that would be my first approach to that question.
I want to ask one final question. I know we need to wrap up, but this is one I'm just curious on your perspective. One thing I see a lot of now, I don't know if this is venturing beyond the realms of the discussion, I see a lot of prejudice now sparked by conflict overseas. I see a lot of Islamophobia, I see a lot of anti-Semitism, I see a lot of just plain prejudice. Mm-hmm. Is that in any way linked? There's no doubt that we live in a very, to be honest, I'm quite glad, I think we live in a very secular society. But do you see a rise of prejudice, and do you see the rise of the prejudice in any way being linked to us, at least in a public space, being very secular?
That, to my mind, is a very complex question.
Sorry, that was a...
And it's a complex question, nobody can explain why. Because if you look back at history, people look at history and they look at my country of Northern Ireland. They say, there you are. How could you possibly believe in God? Look at what religion has done. And I want to say, well, I'm ashamed of that. But please notice that that happened because people disobeyed Christ, not because they obeyed him, because he repudiated violence. So that's point number one. That if we took seriously what Christ said, there wouldn't be Islamophobia. Because we would regard, we started with this, and it's a good thing to finish with it. We would regard every man and woman, whether they believe in God or not, or whether they agree with us or not, as people made in the image of God and therefore of infinite value. It's to do with our intrinsic value system. Now, on the other hand, the amount of blood that has flowed as a result of atheistic philosophies is colossal. I've spent a lot of time in Russia, and I'll never forget that it's been said to me several times by leading Russian intellectuals, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. We found out too late we couldn't. And you see, it's not only the religious side, it's actually the secular atheist side that has caused a lot of damage. And what I plead for is whatever we believe, let's enter the discussion and look at one another as creatures made in the image of God. But you see, you can't do that if you don't believe in God. And you see, what is being taught to our kids? This is the problem to my mind, Raphael. If you teach if you teach generations of children that they're of no more significance, to quote one person, as slime mold, you're going to reap a whirlwind. And we are already reaping it. A leading sociologist, an atheist in Britain, has recently said we're leaving children totally without moorings because there are no standards left anymore. Now that is, of course, a big topic, but for another time.
Okay. Let's all thank the professor. Thank you.
Let's thank a superb moderator.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for welcoming me back. I hope that tonight has lived up to your expectations, and in some way you've been challenged in your assumptions about life, science, and God.